3 years ago, a judge looked me in the eye and told me I'd never see my children again. Not because I hit them, not because I neglected them, but because my own parents sat on that witness stand and systematically destroyed me. And yeah, I've been waiting for this moment ever since. I need to back up because this probably sounds insane. 4 years ago, I was married to Grace, had two kids who were 5 and 7 at the time, worked in construction management, making decent money, normal suburban life kind of thing. Marriage wasn't perfect, but whose is, right? Grace and I had the usual arguments about money and whose turn it was to deal with the kids' school stuff, but nothing that seemed divorce-level serious. Then one Tuesday in March, she sat me down and said she wanted out, said she'd been unhappy for years, that I was too focused on work, that we'd grown apart, all the standard lines you hear. I was blindsided, but I figured okay, we'd do the mature thing, split custody 50-50, keep it civil for the kids. That lasted about 2 weeks. Grace's lawyer came out swinging. Full custody, supervised visitation only, child support calculated at the maximum possible amount. I hired a lawyer and he said not to worry, that initial demands are always aggressive and we'd negotiate something reasonable. Except Grace wasn't negotiating. Every offer my lawyer made got rejected. She wanted the kids full-time and she wanted me paying for it while barely seeing them. My lawyer kept saying we'd win in court because I had no history of anything that would justify supervised visitation. No arrests, no violence, nothing. Just a dad who worked hard and loved his kids. Then my parents got involved. My mom, Elsa, called me maybe 6 weeks into the divorce process. Said she and my dad, Kenneth, wanted to talk, that they were worried about me and wanted to help. I drove over to their house on a Saturday, thinking maybe they'd offer to help with legal fees or watch the kids more so I could work. They sat me down in their living room and my mom did most of the talking. She said they'd been talking to Grace, that Grace had shared some concerns about my mental state and my ability to parent. I asked what concerns and my mom got vague. Just kept saying things like Grace had noticed changes in my behavior and maybe I should consider therapy and anger management. My dad just sat there nodding along. I told them Grace was lying, that this was a tactic to gain advantage in the custody case. My mom gave me this look, this disappointed headshake, and said I was being defensive and that proved Grace's point. That made me angry, and yeah, I raised my voice, told them they were choosing my ex-wife over their own son. My dad finally spoke up and said if I couldn't stay calm discussing this, then maybe Grace had a point about my temper. I left before I said something I couldn't take back. 2 months later, I was sitting in family court for our custody hearing. My lawyer had prepared me for Grace's testimony, had prepped me on staying calm and factual on the stand. What he hadn't prepared me for was seeing my parents walk into that courtroom and sit on Grace's side. I actually froze when I saw them. My lawyer leaned over and asked if I knew why they were there, and I said I had no idea, but it couldn't be good. Grace testified first. Lots of crying, lots of talking about how I'd become angry and unpredictable, how she feared for the children's safety, how I'd put work before family. All lies or massive exaggerations of normal marital disagreements. My lawyer cross-examined her pretty effectively, and I could see the judge wasn't entirely buying it. Then Grace's lawyer called Elsa to the stand. My mother walked up there in her church clothes and swore to tell the truth. Then she proceeded to tell the judge that I'd always been unstable even as a child, that I had anger issues that had concerned her for years, that she'd witnessed me screaming at my children on multiple occasions. She said Grace had confided in her about my behavior and that as a grandmother she felt obligated to speak up. She said the children deserved better than I could provide. She said I needed serious help before I should be allowed around kids unsupervised. The judge asked if she'd actually witnessed abuse, and my mom said she'd seen enough to be deeply concerned for her grandchildren's safety. My lawyer tried to object, tried to get her testimony limited, but family court judges have wide discretion, and this judge wanted to hear what Grandma had to say. Kenneth testified next, backed up everything Elsa said, added that I'd been a disappointment my whole life, that I'd never lived up to my potential, that this custody fight proved I cared more about winning than about what was best for the kids. Said my behavior in their living room that Saturday had been exactly the kind of thing Grace was talking about, called what they were doing damage control. I sat there listening to this and couldn't process it. These were my parents, the people who'd raised me, who I'd called every week, who I'd spent every holiday with. And they were sitting 15 feet away, calmly telling a judge I was dangerous. My lawyer put me on the stand after. I tried to refute everything, but my voice was shaking, and I know I sounded defensive and angry because I was. The judge asked me directly about the incident at my parents' house, and I admitted I'd raised my voice, but said it was because they'd ambushed me with accusations. Judge asked if I'd sworn at them, and technically, yeah, I had when I was leaving. Asked if I'd punched a wall, which I also had, and suddenly their testimony sounded a lot more credible than mine. Grace's lawyer hammered me on cross-examination. Brought up every time I'd worked late, Every missed school event framed my entire parenting history as negligent. Asked why my own parents would testify against me if there wasn't real cause for concern. I didn't have a good answer for that one. Judge took a 15-minute recess, then came back and ruled from the bench. Terminated my parental rights completely. Not supervised visits, not limited custody, nothing. Said the testimony from my parents combined with my demonstrated anger issues and inability to take responsibility made me an unfit parent. Said it was in the best interests of the children to have no contact with me. Grace got everything. I got a court order to stay away from my own kids. I walked out of that courthouse and my brother Liam was waiting in the hallway. He'd been there the whole time but hadn't testified. He tried to talk to me, said something about how he was sorry but didn't understand what just happened. I asked if he'd known our parents were going to testify, and he admitted, yeah, they'd told him the night before. Asked if he'd tried to stop them, and he just looked at his shoes. I told him we were done, and walked away. Spent the next few months in a dark place. Lost 20 pounds because I barely ate. Kept showing up to work because I needed the income, but I was going through the motions. My lawyer filed appeals, but they went nowhere because family court judges have enormous discretion, and parental rights terminations are hard to overturn, especially when grandparents testify against you. He said our best shot was waiting a few years and petitioning to restore rights, but even that would require my parents to recant their testimony, and he said that basically never happens. That's when something shifted in me. I'd been wallowing in what I'd lost, but I realized I needed to focus on what I still had. I had my income, I had my career, I had my freedom from Grace, and I had time to think clearly about exactly what had happened and why. See, my parents had always favored Liam. He was the golden child, got better grades, went to a better college, married a woman my mom actually approved of. I was the one who disappointed them by going into construction instead of something white-collar, by marrying Grace, who came from a less affluent family, by just generally not being what they'd envisioned. But I'd never thought they actually hated me. Turns out I was wrong about that. I started digging into why they'd done it, made some calls, asked the right questions, found out that Grace had gotten close to my parents during the marriage, closer than I'd realized. She'd been feeding them complaints about me for years, cultivating them as allies. When the divorce started, she went straight to them and got them on her side before I even knew there was a war. And my parents went along with it because destroying me meant keeping access to their grandchildren through Grace, meant maintaining their relationship with her, meant choosing the daughter-in-law they'd always liked better anyway. But here's the thing. My parents own their house, but it's mortgaged. They have retirement accounts, but not enough to live comfortably if they lost their house. And they'd been planning to move in a few years to a smaller place and use the equity from their current house to fund their retirement. They needed everything to go smoothly financially. I spent the last 3 years getting my life back together with one specific goal in mind. I got promoted twice. Now I'm a senior project manager making significantly more than before. I bought a house, not just an apartment, but an actual nice house in a good neighborhood. I got therapy not because I needed it, but because having a therapist's statement that I'm mentally sound would be useful later. I documented everything about my life, showing I'm stable and successful. And most importantly, I quietly got into a position where I had significant control over something my parents desperately needed. They have no idea what's coming. Grace doesn't either. And Liam's about to find out that being complicit in destroying your brother has consequences. The revenge I've been planning isn't illegal, but it's going to hurt them in ways they can't recover from easily. Financial pressure, social pressure, emotional pressure, all perfectly legal but absolutely devastating. I've spent 3 years being patient, and now the pieces are finally falling into place. Liam called me 2 days ago. First time I've heard his voice since the courthouse. He left a voicemail saying we needed to talk, that it was urgent, that it involved our parents. I haven't called back yet because I want him to sweat a little longer. Want him to wonder why I'm not responding. Want him to start putting together what I've already set in motion. Because here's the thing about revenge that takes years to plan. You don't get emotional about it anymore. You get methodical. And right now, I'm watching the first domino start to wobble, and I haven't even touched it yet. Update 1. So I called Liam back yesterday afternoon. Figured I'd made him wait long enough, and honestly, I wanted to hear what was so urgent that he'd break 3 years of silence. I was sitting in my home office when I dialed. Had my laptop open with spreadsheets I'd been maintaining for months. Wanted to make sure I had all the facts straight in my head before this conversation started. He picked up on the first ring, started talking immediately. Didn't even say hello first, just launched into asking where I'd been and why I hadn't called him back sooner, and did I have any idea what was happening. I let him ramble for maybe 30 seconds before I cut him off and said I had a pretty good idea what was happening actually, but why didn't he explain it from his perspective? That shut him up for a second. Then he said mom and dad were in serious trouble, that they were about to lose everything, that he'd been trying to help them, but the situation was getting worse every day, I asked what kind of trouble specifically, and he said financial trouble, legal trouble, problems with their house and their retirement and their whole future, basically. Said it all started about 6 weeks ago and had been snowballing since then. I asked him to start from the beginning and actually explain what was going on instead of just panicking at me. He took a breath and laid it out. Apparently, my parents had been planning to sell their house this spring and move to a smaller place in a retirement community about 30 miles away. They'd already put a deposit down on the new place, had been making plans for months. The sale of their current house was supposed to fund the move and pad their retirement accounts. Except now the sale was falling apart and they were going to lose their deposit and potentially end up owing a lot of money they didn't have. I asked why the sale was falling apart and Liam got quiet for a minute. Then he said there were problems with the inspection, problems with the title, problems with permits for additions Dad had done years ago, just a whole cascade of issues that kept coming up. Every time they thought they'd resolved something, something else would pop up. Their realtor was freaking out, the buyers were threatening to walk, and my parents were scrambling to fix everything, but it was costing them thousands of dollars they hadn't budgeted for. And that wasn't even the worst part, according to Liam. Apparently, several of Mom's friends had stopped talking to her in the last month. Her book club had asked her not to come back. Dad had been asked to step down from some community board he'd been on for years. Their church had gotten complaints about them. Liam said they were becoming pariahs in their own neighborhood. And Mom was devastated because she couldn't figure out what she'd done wrong. I asked if he seriously couldn't figure out what was happening, and Liam said he had suspicions, but he wanted to hear it from me, wanted me to tell him if I was behind it. So I told him, yeah, I was behind all of it, every single thing, and I'd been planning it for 3 years. See, here's what I'd actually done. About 2 years ago, I started attending the same church my parents go to. Not every week, but often enough that people recognized me. Often enough that I could have conversations after services. I'd introduce myself as Kenneth and Elsa's son, the one they didn't talk about much, and people would get curious. I'd mention casually that I had 2 kids I wasn't allowed to see because of a bitter custody dispute, would say my ex-wife had turned my own parents against me, gotten them to testify in court, and that I was still trying to understand why they'd done it. Never accused them of lying. Never got angry or dramatic. Just expressed confusion and hurt. Did the same thing with Mom's book club. Joined it about 18 months ago when they were recruiting new members. Participated in discussions, brought good snacks, was a perfectly pleasant addition to the group. And occasionally, when the conversation turned personal, I'd mention my situation. Would talk about how hard it was to be estranged from your children, to have your own parents choose your ex-wife over you, to wonder what you'd done to deserve that kind of betrayal. Other book club members would offer sympathy, and I'd thank them and change the subject. Never dwelt on it. Did similar things in other contexts. Dad's community board meetings were public, so I started attending them. Would ask informed questions, contribute to discussions, establish myself as a concerned community member, got to know the other board members over time, eventually worked into conversation that I was Kenneth's son, that we had a complicated relationship, that he'd testified against me in a custody case, and I was still processing that. The thing is, I never lied about anything, never exaggerated, just shared my story when it came up naturally and let people draw their own conclusions. And people did draw conclusions. Started looking at my parents differently. Started asking them questions about their son and the grandkids they'd helped take away from him. My parents would try to explain that they'd done what was best for the children, that I had serious issues, but the more they tried to defend themselves, the worse it sounded. Because here's the thing about small communities and churches and social groups. People love gossip, but they also love judging parents who turn on their own children, especially when the child in question shows up to book club being perfectly normal and pleasant, while the parents are getting defensive and angry about questions. My calm, hurt confusion played a lot better than their increasingly desperate justifications. The house problems were more direct. I work in construction management, and I know every inspector, every permit office clerk, every contractor in this area. When my parents put their house on the market, I made some calls, asked people to look extra carefully at the permits for that addition Dad had done 12 years ago. The one he'd done himself with his buddies instead of hiring licensed contractors. Asked them to be thorough with the inspection, not to miss anything that might be a code violation. Mentioned that the property might have title issues from a lot line dispute with the neighbors 20 years back that might not have been properly resolved. None of this was illegal. I wasn't filing false reports or bribing inspectors. I was just making sure that every legitimate problem with that property got found and documented. And there were a lot of problems because Dad had cut corners and done things himself without proper permits. The house had been fine to live in, but selling it was a different story because buyers want everything documented and up to code. Every problem that came up could be fixed, but it cost money and time. The buyers were getting impatient. My parents were burning through their savings trying to make repairs and get permits retroactively approved. And the whole time, their social lives were crumbling because people in their community were icing them out based on what I'd been casually sharing for 2 years. I explained all of this to Liam while he stayed silent on the other end of the phone. When I finished, he asked if I understood what I was doing to them, if I realized they were both in their 60s, and this kind of stress could seriously damage their health. I said, yeah, I understood perfectly. Same way I understood that destroying my relationship with my children had seriously damaged my mental health, but they'd done it anyway. Liam tried a different approach, said I was better than this, that revenge wasn't going to bring my kids back, that I needed to let go of my anger and move on. I actually laughed at that one. Told him I'd spent 3 years being methodical and careful and patient specifically because I wasn't just angry anymore. Angry was what I'd been in that courthouse. This was calculated. He said mom was crying every night, that dad had started having chest pains from the stress, that they were terrified of losing everything they'd worked for their whole lives. I said good, they should be terrified. Because I wanted them to feel a fraction of what I'd felt sitting in that courtroom listening to them call me unfit and dangerous. Wanted them to experience losing something irreplaceable, the way I'd lost my kids. Liam switched tactics again, asked what it would take for me to stop, what they could do to make this right. I told him they could start by recanting their testimony in court, by admitting publicly that they'd lied or, at minimum, exaggerated to help Grace win custody. He said they couldn't do that. It would open them up to perjury charges, could get them in serious legal trouble. I said then I guess they're stuck with the consequences of their choices. Then he said something that caught my attention. Said Grace was asking questions too, that she'd called mom last week wondering why I'd suddenly started going to their church and joining their social groups. Said Grace was getting paranoid that I was planning something that involved her too. I asked what mom had told her, and Liam said mom had tried to downplay it. Told Grace I was probably just trying to reconnect with family, indirectly or something. But Grace wasn't buying it. That was interesting because I'd been careful to keep Grace out of the initial phase. Wanted to deal with my parents first. Let them feel the pressure, let them realize what was happening to them was because of what they'd done to me. But if Grace was getting worried, that meant she was paying attention. Meant she understood on some level that actions have consequences. I asked Liam what exactly Grace was afraid of, and he said she was worried I was building a case to try to restore my parental rights, that all my stability over the last 3 years, plus my parents' social destruction, could be used to show that their testimony had been biased or motivated by something other than the kids' welfare. I told him that was actually not a bad idea, and I might look into it. Thanks for the suggestion. Liam said I was being cruel, and I needed to think about what this was doing to the whole family. I said there was no family. That ended 3 years ago in that courthouse. He said he was still my brother, and he'd always cared about me even if he'd made mistakes. I said standing silently by while mom and dad destroyed me wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And choices have consequences just like actions do. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said he was sorry, that he should have done more to stop them, that he'd been a coward and he knew that now. Said if he could go back, he'd do things differently. I told him apologies 3 years too late weren't particularly useful and didn't change anything about the current situation. He asked if there was anything he could do now, any way he could help fix this. I said he could start by explaining to mom and dad exactly what was happening to them and why, since they apparently hadn't figured it out yet. He said they knew it was me. They'd known for a couple weeks now. Said mom had put together that I'd been attending her church and dad had heard from someone that I'd been at community board meetings. They'd realized I'd been systematically infiltrating their social circles and destroying their reputation. But they didn't know what to do about it because I hadn't technically done anything illegal or even explicitly malicious. I'd just told the truth about what happened. I said that was the beauty of it, really. They'd chosen to testify against me in open court, made those statements part of the public record, and now they had to live with people knowing what they'd done, had to live with their community judging them for it, had to live with the social and financial consequences of deciding their grandchildren were better off without their father. Liam asked how long I was planning to keep this up, and I said, until I felt like they'd suffered proportionally to what they'd cost me. He said that was too vague, that I needed to give them something concrete to work toward. I said maybe I'd know it when I saw it, or maybe I wouldn't. Maybe this was just how their lives were going to be now. Then he brought up something I hadn't expected. Said Daisy, Liam's wife, wanted to talk to me. Said she'd been angry at mom and dad herself when she found out what they'd done. That she'd argued with them about it multiple times. Said she'd been telling Liam for 3 years that the family needed to make this right with me, but nobody had listened to her. Now she wanted to talk to me directly. Wanted to understand what I needed, to feel like justice had been served. I told Liam I'd think about it, but I wasn't making any promises. He said that was more than he'd expected, and he'd take it. Then he asked one more time if I'd consider backing off on the house problems. Said if the sale fell through, it wouldn't just hurt mom and dad financially, It would destroy their retirement plans and potentially force them to work into their 70s. I said they should have thought of that before they destroyed my relationship with my children. We hung up after that. I sat in my office looking at my spreadsheets and thinking about what Liam had said about Grace getting worried. That opened up some interesting possibilities I hadn't fully planned out yet. Because if Grace was paying attention to what was happening to my parents, she'd start wondering what might happen to her, and that kind of anxiety could make people do stupid things. I've spent 3 years being patient and methodical, but now things are accelerating faster than I'd anticipated. Multiple people are starting to understand what's happening and why. And the best part is, I'm not done. Not even close. The house sale is just one pressure point. The social destruction is just one avenue. I've got other things in motion that Liam doesn't even know about yet. Things that involve their retirement accounts, their insurance, their long-term financial security, all perfectly legal, all perfectly justified, all designed to make them understand what it feels like to have your future ripped away by people who are supposed to love you. Liam's going to call back. Daisy's going to want to meet. Grace is going to get more paranoid. And my parents are going to keep scrambling trying to fix problems that I'm going to keep creating faster than they can solve them. This is what 3 years of planning looks like. This is what happens when you give someone time to think clearly about revenge instead of acting emotionally. And I'm just getting started. Update 2. So Daisy reached out to me directly 3 days after my call with Liam. She texted me from a number I didn't have saved, introduced herself, and asked if we could meet somewhere to talk. Said she had information I needed to hear and that she wanted to discuss it without Liam present. That got my attention because anything Daisy wanted to say, without my brother knowing, was probably something he wouldn't want her saying. We met at a botanical garden about 40 minutes from where I live, halfway between our houses. Thursday afternoon, middle of the week, not too crowded. She was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench near the entrance. I hadn't seen her in 3 years and she looked older, more tired than I remembered. We said hello and started walking through the gardens because she said she thought better when she was moving. Daisy started by saying she owed me an apology, not for testifying against me because she hadn't been at the custody hearing, but for not doing more to stop what happened. She said she'd known for months before the court date that Elsa and Kenneth were planning to testify for Grace, had argued with them about it repeatedly, told them they were making a massive mistake that would destroy the family. They'd told her to stay out of it, that she didn't understand the full situation, that they were doing what was necessary to protect their grandchildren. I asked why she'd never told me what was coming, and Daisy said she'd tried once. Had called me about 2 weeks before the hearing under the guise of asking about the kids, tried to hint that I should prepare for something bad. But I'd been distracted and stressed about the divorce and hadn't picked up on what she was trying to tell me. She'd wanted to be more direct, but Liam had made her promise not to interfere. Said it would cause problems in their marriage if she took sides against his parents. So she'd stayed quiet and watched it happen. Said she'd never forgiven herself for that and had been telling Liam for 3 years that the family needed to make it right. But nobody had listened until now when I was actively destroying them. Suddenly, everyone wanted to negotiate. I asked what she thought making it right would look like, and Daisy said that was the complicated part. She understood why I was angry, understood why I wanted revenge, but she was worried about what this was doing to Liam. Said he was caught between loyalty to his parents and guilt about what they'd done to me. Was barely sleeping, was drinking more than usual, was stressed to the point where it was affecting their marriage. She wanted me to understand that my revenge wasn't just hitting my parents. It was damaging her life too. I told her that wasn't really my problem, that Liam had made choices 3 years ago and was living with the consequences now, same as everyone else. Daisy got quiet for a minute, then said she'd expected that response but had to try anyway. Then she told me something I hadn't known. Grace had been pressuring my parents for months before the custody hearing, not just feeding them complaints about me, but actively coaching them on what to say in court. Had practiced testimony with them, had helped them frame their concerns in ways that would sound credible to a judge. Daisy had overheard some of these practice sessions when she and Liam had been at my parents' house for dinner, had heard Grace telling Elsa exactly how to respond to certain questions, how to appear concerned but not vindictive, how to make it sound like she was speaking up reluctantly rather than eagerly. I asked if Grace had offered them anything in exchange for testifying, and Daisy said not money but access. Grace had promised them they'd maintain a close relationship with the kids, that she'd bring them over regularly, that they'd still be involved grandparents. Had basically sold them the idea that destroying me was the only way to stay in their grandchildren's lives. And my parents had bought it because they'd already decided I was the disappointment and Grace was the keeper. That information was useful, but I asked why she was telling me now. Daisy said because Grace had been pulling back lately, had been bringing the kids around less often, had been making excuses about why the grandparents couldn't see them. My parents were starting to realize that Grace had used them and was now reducing their access anyway, now that she'd gotten what she wanted. They were losing both me and the grandkids and were finally understanding what they'd actually done. I asked if that meant they regretted their testimony, and Daisy said she thought they did, but they'd never admit it publicly. Were too proud, too afraid of the legal consequences, too invested in the narrative that they'd done the right thing. But privately, especially in the last few weeks as everything had been falling apart, she'd heard Kenneth say multiple times that maybe they'd been too hasty, that maybe they should have stayed out of it. We sat down on another bench and I asked Daisy what she actually wanted from this conversation. She said she wanted me to consider giving them a way out. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but some kind of defined terms where if they met certain conditions, I'd back off. Said the uncertainty of not knowing when or if I'd stop was driving everyone crazy and making the situation worse. If I could give them something concrete to work toward, it might be possible to resolve this without completely destroying what was left of the family. I told her the family was already destroyed and had been for 3 years. She said it could get worse, that there were still relationships worth saving, that Liam was trying to maintain some kind of connection with me, even if I wasn't interested. I said Liam had his chance to maintain a connection when he stood silent in that courthouse hallway and chose not to. Daisy switched tactics, asked what I wanted with Grace, said she could tell from how I'd reacted earlier that the information about Grace's manipulation had given me ideas. I told her Grace should be worried because if my parents thought they'd been used, they'd eventually get angry about it. And angry people who'd already committed perjury once might be willing to tell a different story if they felt betrayed enough. She asked if I was planning to drive a wedge between Grace and my parents, and I said I wasn't planning to do anything, just going to let them figure out on their own that Grace had sold them a bill of goods and was now cutting them off from the grandkids they'd betrayed me to stay close to. Nature would take its course from there. Daisy said that was manipulative, and I asked if it was more manipulative than coaching your parents-in-law to commit perjury. She didn't have an answer for that. We talked for another hour about other things. She told me the kids were doing okay, that they were 9 and 11 now, that the older one had asked about me a few months ago and Grace had shut down the conversation immediately. Said the younger one didn't really remember me anymore, which hit harder than I wanted to admit. Daisy said she'd tried to keep my memory alive with them when she saw them, but Grace had asked her to stop, said it was confusing for the children. I asked if she'd stopped, and Daisy said mostly yes, because Grace had threatened to cut off Liam's access to his niece and nephew if Daisy kept mentioning me. So she'd backed down to preserve Liam's relationship with them. I pointed out that was the same calculation my parents had made, choosing access to the kids over loyalty to me, and Daisy said yes, and she understood how I'd ended up here. Before we left, I asked her one more question, asked if she knew why my parents had really done it, beyond Grace's manipulation and promises. Was it just favoritism toward Liam, just disappointment in me, or was there something else? Daisy was quiet for a long time. Then she said she thought Elsa had always been afraid I'd turn out like Kenneth's brother, who'd struggled with mental health issues and had estranged himself from the family decades ago. Said my mom had seen similarities between me and him, had convinced herself I was unstable even though there was no real evidence of it. When Grace had come to her with concerns, Elsa had latched onto them as confirmation of fears she'd had for years. Kenneth had gone along with it because he always went along with whatever Elsa decided. So basically, my mother had projected her fears about her brother-in-law onto me and used the custody battle as justification to act on those fears, had destroyed my relationship with my children because of something that happened in a completely different family relationship 30 years ago. That was actually worse than simple favoritism because it meant the decision had nothing to do with who I actually was. Daisy and I parted ways with her, asking me to think about what she'd said. I told her I would, but made no promises. She said that was fair, and that she hoped I found whatever peace I was looking for. I drove home and started making calls. Because if my parents were starting to feel used by Grace, and if Grace was already pulling back on grandparent access, then the situation was ripe for acceleration. I'd been planning to let things develop slowly, but Daisy had given me information that changed the timeline. That Friday, I drove to my parents' house. First time I'd been there in 3 years. Parked in their driveway, walked up to the front door and knocked. Kenneth answered, and the look on his face when he saw me was worth the whole drive. He tried to close the door, but I put my foot in it and told him we needed to talk. Said I could do it inside or I could do it on his front porch where all the neighbors could see. His choice. He let me in. Elsa was in the living room and stood up when she saw me. Started to say something, but I held up my hand and told her I wasn't there for a conversation. I was there to explain exactly what was happening to them and why. I laid it out for them, told them everything I'd done over the last 2 years. The church attendance, the book club, the community board meetings, all the casual conversations where I'd shared what they'd done to me. Told them about the house problems I'd ensured would be found, about the inspection issues and permit problems that were legitimate but wouldn't have been flagged if I hadn't made sure the right people were paying attention. Kenneth tried to interrupt and say I had no right to sabotage their house sale. I asked if he'd had the right to testify that I was an unfit parent when he knew it wasn't true. He said he'd believed what he'd said on that stand, that he'd genuinely been concerned about my mental state. I asked if he was still concerned or if he was starting to realize Grace had manipulated him. That got his attention. I asked how often they'd seen their grandchildren in the last 6 months. Elsa said not as much as they'd like, that Grace had been busy. I said Grace had been pulling away because she didn't need them anymore, that she'd gotten what she wanted, and now they were becoming inconvenient. Asked if they'd noticed Grace had stopped returning their calls as promptly, stopped being as friendly, stopped making plans as far in advance. Elsa insisted Grace was just busy with the kids and work. I said Grace had used them to destroy me and was now discarding them because maintaining a relationship with people who'd testified against their own son was awkward at school functions and parent groups. Asked them when they'd last been invited to a school event for the kids. Elsa couldn't remember a specific recent one. Kenneth told me to get to the point. I said the point was they'd traded their son for access to grandchildren they were losing anyway, had destroyed me for nothing, and now they were going to spend the rest of their lives dealing with the social and financial consequences of that decision. Elsa started crying and said I had no idea what I'd put them through. The stress, the embarrassment, the fear of losing everything. I said good. Now she knew how I'd felt sitting in that courtroom, knew what it was like to be destroyed by people who were supposed to protect you. Kenneth said I was being cruel and vindictive. I said I was being methodical and that there was a difference. Cruel would have been acting immediately out of rage. Vindictive would have been illegal or disproportionate. This was calculated justice delivered over years of careful planning. I told them the house sale was going to fall through, that even if they fixed every problem I'd made sure was discovered, the buyers were going to walk because I'd had a conversation with them too, had introduced myself as the son whose parents had testified against him in court, had mentioned I was worried about my parents' financial stability and ability to maintain the property. Buyers don't want to purchase homes from sellers who might end up in financial distress and unable to complete the transaction cleanly. Elsa asked what I wanted from them. I said I wanted them to feel what I'd felt, wanted them to experience having their future ripped away, wanted them to understand that actions have consequences and you don't get to destroy someone and then just move on like it never happened. Kenneth asked if there was anything they could do to make me stop. I said they could recant their testimony in court, but we all knew they wouldn't do that. Could admit publicly they'd been manipulated by Grace, but that would make them look foolish. Could try to rebuild a relationship with me, but that wasn't happening either. So really, they were just going to have to live with this. I stood up to leave, and Elsa asked about the kids, asked if I ever thought about them, if I missed them, if I wanted to be part of their lives again. I said I thought about them every single day and had missed 3 years of their lives because of what she and Kenneth had done. Said maybe someday I'd pursue restoring my parental rights, but right now, I was focused on making sure my parents understood what they'd cost me. Kenneth followed me to the door and said this wasn't over, said they had lawyers too, that they could fight back, that I couldn't just systematically destroy their lives without consequences. I said they should call their lawyers and ask what laws I'd broken, what actionable offenses I'd committed by attending public church services or telling the truth about what had happened in court. Their lawyers would tell them I'd done nothing illegal and there was nothing they could do to stop me. I left them standing in their doorway and drove home. That was 4 days ago, and I haven't heard from them directly since. But Liam called me yesterday morning at 3 a.m. That's the call I mentioned in my first post, the one where he was sobbing and begging. He said Mom had been having panic attacks, that Dad had been to the ER twice for chest pains, that their retirement was gone, their house was worthless if they couldn't sell it, their social lives were destroyed, said I'd won, that I'd made my point, that I needed to stop now before I actually killed them. I told him I'd stop when I felt like they'd suffered proportionally to what they'd cost me. He asked when that would be, and I said I'd know it when I saw it. He said I was going to regret this someday, that I was becoming the monster they'd accused me of being in court. I said if that's what it took, then fine. He hung up on me, and I went back to sleep. Because the thing is, I'm not losing sleep over this. Haven't lost sleep in months. I'm sleeping better than I have in 3 years because finally, the people who destroyed me are facing consequences. And Grace? Grace called Elsa yesterday trying to figure out what I was doing and what it meant for her. My mom apparently told her that I was systematically destroying them, and that Grace should be worried because if I could do this to my own parents, what would I do to my ex-wife who'd started the whole thing? Grace called Liam after that asking if I'd made any threats toward her. Liam told her no threats, but that I'd mentioned potentially pursuing restoration of parental rights now that I had years of documented stability and could argue my parents' testimony had been biased. So Grace is scared. My parents are desperate. Liam is begging. And I'm sitting here planning the next phase. Because Daisy was right about one thing. I do have plans for Grace. And if my parents are starting to feel betrayed by her, well, that just makes what comes next even easier. Final update. Liam didn't stop after that 3 a.m. call. He called again at 7 a.m., then twice more that afternoon. I finally picked up Thursday evening just to get him to stop. The house sale had officially fallen through that morning. Buyers walked away from all the problems that kept emerging. My parents were stuck with a house they couldn't sell and had already lost the deposit on their retirement community. Nearly $40,000 gone in 2 months between repairs, legal fees, and forfeited deposits. I told Liam I understood perfectly because I'd planned all of it. Then he said something surprising. Grace had contacted him asking if there was any way to negotiate with me. She was willing to discuss modifying custody if I'd back off from whatever I was planning for her. I told him I wasn't interested in negotiations and hung up, but that gave me an idea. Grace scared enough to offer negotiations meant she was vulnerable, and I'd been building my case without even meaning to. 3 years of documented stability, professional success, psychological evaluations, and my parents' recent behavior showing they'd had personal motivations beyond the children's welfare. I filed a petition for restoration of parental rights Friday afternoon, public record, which meant Grace would find out soon. She found out Saturday morning and started calling me directly for the first time in 3 years. I let several calls go to voicemail before calling back that evening. She wanted to meet, wanted to work out a modified visitation schedule without involving courts again. I asked why she was suddenly interested in giving me access after 3 years of keeping them away. She said she'd always intended for me to have a relationship with them eventually, just wanted to make sure I was stable first. I reminded her that her lawyer had argued I should never see them again. Then I asked her directly about coaching my parents before the custody hearing. How many practice sessions? How many times she'd told them exactly what to say. She denied it, but I told her I already knew. She switched to saying she'd just help them organize their thoughts. I told her I'd filed for restoration and intended to pursue it fully, that I had 3 years of evidence and would argue the original termination was based on testimony from parents who had been manipulated by her. She said I couldn't prove they'd lied. I said I didn't need to prove outright lies, just that they'd been influenced by factors beyond the children's welfare. And now that she was cutting them off anyway, they might be willing to admit they'd exaggerated. We argued for 20 minutes. Her trying to negotiate, me refusing. She hung up on me. Because for the last year I'd been attending school board meetings at the kids' school, introducing myself as a concerned community member, eventually mentioning I had children there but wasn't allowed to see them due to a custody dispute. Some parents knew Grace and started asking her questions. Why would your ex's own parents testify against him? If something was really wrong, why is he at school meetings acting normal? Grace's image as protective single mother was developing cracks. Monday, one of the parents asked her point blank at pickup about my parents testifying against me. Grace tried to shut it down, but other parents had been wondering the same thing. She called me Monday night screaming about poisoning her social environment. I said I hadn't said anything untrue. She threatened a restraining order, and I said good luck proving harassment when I'd only attended public meetings and answered questions honestly. Then Tuesday, Kenneth called me. Not Liam, but my father directly for the first time in 3 years. He wanted to meet in person, just us. We met Wednesday morning at a park. He looked terrible, aged a decade in 3 years. He said he'd been thinking about the custody hearing and why they'd testified. Grace had been convincing, had shown them messages and told stories that scared them. But more than that, Elsa had wanted to believe it because of Kenneth's brother decades ago. She'd convinced herself I was showing the same signs. I asked if he'd actually believed I was unstable. Kenneth admitted he hadn't been sure, but Elsa had been so certain and it had felt like the safe choice. Then he said he was angry at Grace. They'd kept up their end by maintaining their testimony and not contacting me, but she'd been steadily reducing their access to the grandchildren anyway. They saw the kids maybe once a month now, brief, supervised visits. They'd realized too late that Grace had used them to eliminate me and was now eliminating them too. Kenneth asked if admitting he'd been influenced by Grace and Elsa's fears rather than objective evidence could help me get my rights restored. I said it might, but would expose him to perjury charges and destroy his relationship with Grace. He said he didn't care about Grace anymore and couldn't live with what they'd done. I told him I had conditions. He needed to be fully honest about Grace's coaching and manipulation, needed to admit their concerns had been exaggerated and based on projection rather than evidence. He agreed. Thursday afternoon, Elsa called. Kenneth had told her about our conversation and she wanted to talk too. We met at the same park. She apologized, said she'd made a terrible mistake, let her fears about Kenneth's brother cloud her judgment. Looking back, what Grace had told her was just normal relationship conflict magnified. I asked why she'd been so eager to believe Grace over me. Elsa said because I'd always been difficult, hadn't fit their expectations, had chosen construction over a professional career, married Grace, who wasn't from their social circle. Some part of her had wanted to believe I'd failed as a parent too because it would validate her other disappointments. She said she'd admit that in court if it would help me get my children back. Friday morning, I told my lawyer about their offers to recant. He said it was exactly what we needed. With my parents willing to testify that their original testimony had been influenced by Grace and their own fears rather than evidence, combined with my 3 years of stability, we had a strong case. Saturday afternoon, Grace showed up at my house unannounced. Demanded to know what I'd said to my parents to make them turn against her. I said I'd just told them the truth about how she'd been cutting them off after they'd done what she wanted. She said I was destroying everything, would ruin my children's lives by dragging them back to court. I said she'd ruined their lives 3 years ago by eliminating their father. Grace asked what it would take for me to walk away. Money? I said I didn't want her money. She asked what I did want, and I said I wanted her to feel what I'd felt. She said I'd never get full custody. I said I'd take supervised visitation and build from there. Eventually, the kids would be old enough to decide for themselves. She said she'd tell them everything about why they'd been kept from me. I said teenagers tended to rebel against parents who'd lied to them. She left threatening to fight me with everything she had. I told her to go ahead because I'd been planning this for 3 years. Sunday morning, Liam called saying Grace had contacted him in a panic, asked if I'd thought about what this was doing to the kids. I said Grace should have thought about their well-being before she manipulated my parents into helping terminate my rights completely. I'd made my decision. I was accepting Kenneth and Elsa's offer to recant, was pursuing full restoration of parental rights, was putting Grace through exactly the legal hell she'd put me through. Because this is about justice, about making people face proportional consequences. My parents destroyed my relationship with my children to maintain access to grandchildren they barely see now. Grace manipulated vulnerable people into committing perjury to eliminate competition for custody. Now they're facing the results. My parents are financially ruined, socially destroyed, consumed with guilt. Grace is watching her story fall apart. Liam is caught between loyalty and recognition of what they did. The restoration hearing is just the beginning. My parents' recantation combined with Grace's parental alienation means I can build toward more custody over time. The kids will get older and start asking questions Grace can't answer. Eventually, they'll figure out they were lied to. That's the real revenge. Not just destroying the people who destroyed me, but ensuring their victory was temporary while my vindication is permanent. They took 3 years from me, and I'm taking their peace of mind, their financial security, their social standing, and eventually their control over my children. Liam's 3 a.m. call was just the beginning of their begging. It's going to get worse before this is over, because they called me unfit and dangerous and mentally unstable. Turns out I'm none of those things, but I am patient, methodical, and absolutely unforgiving. And that's exactly what they deserve.